Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabrielle Sedor. I am the Chief Operations Officer with Anchor. We are thrilled and delighted to be partnering with our friends at TASH to present to you training and skill sets for employment support specialists. Our speakers today are John Butterworth, Alberto Migliore, and Sean Wood. The webinar today is going to focus on training skill sets for employment support specialists. Presenters will cover the big picture of the employment landscape and the current environment of job coaching, systematic instruction, workplace adaptation, high and low-tech solutions, and the supporting data and research behind all of that. We will be issuing a recording of today's webinar, which should be available shortly after it's finished today. We welcome you to use the chat box in your lower left-hand side to communicate with us and ask your questions throughout today's presentation. We will get to as many as we can. While we're waiting, I ask that you take a minute and look at the poll and go ahead and answer that question. What is your primary role at your organization? As you're looking at that poll, I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers today. John Butterworth is the Director of Employment Systems Change and Evaluation at the Institute for Community Inclusion at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. He has over 35 years of experience in research, systems change, training, and employment support. His current projects include Access to Integrated Employment, the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Advancing Employment, and the State Employment Leadership Network. He's joined by Alberto Migliore, who is a research associate at the Institute for Community Inclusion, also at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, since 2006. His research focuses on supporting employment consultants in their work with job seekers with intellectual disabilities. He gained a bachelor's degree in political science, a master's in disability management, and a PhD in special education. In Italy, where Alberto grew up, he co-founded a social cooperative supporting adults with intellectual disabilities in community work. Our last speaker today is Mr. Sean Wood, who's the Senior Program Manager at WISE. Sean is a community developer who's passionate about social justice, equality of opportunity, and has worked to support people with disabilities since 2002. Since then, he continues to work in schools, people's homes, and job sites to help build inclusive communities. Sean is a board-certified behavioral analyst and a certified employment specialist. He served in the United States Peace Corps in Bulgaria and surrounding countries, and has his master's in education in applied behavioral analysis and his Bachelor of Arts in political science and human rights. Sean is particularly interested in using ABA, emerging technology, reflective processes, and mentorship to drive employment outcomes. So before we turn things over to the speaker, Ruthie Beckwith, who is the director of TASH, and I would like to just go over a few housekeeping tips and also tell you a little bit about our organizations. Before we get started, audio will be delivered through your computer speakers. If you can't hear us, double-check your computer speaker's connection and the volume, refresh your internet connection, or use the call option to listen by phone. And I'll go ahead and post that number in just a second. If you have questions, use the chat box in the lower left of your screen. And as I mentioned, the webinar recording and the slides will be available within the next few hours. A little bit about Anchor for those of you who don't know us. Our name stands for the American Network of Community Options and Resources. We are a national trade association that supports providers who provide supports and services to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There's over 1 million people with disabilities and their families who receive supports through Anchor members, and our direct support professional workforce is well over 700,000. Our member benefits include government relations representation, access to content, discounts on technology, and of course educational opportunities like this, which we are pleased to join with TASH to offer to you. Ruthie, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about TASH and I see that some folks are having some challenges with the audio, so I'm going to go ahead and post a number to dial in.
Thank
Ruthie,
you.
over to you.
Yes, thank you, Gabby, and I am delighted to be here for the most recent session in our partnership on employment. TASH is an organization, we're a national disability rights organization, and we were founded in 1975 with a focus on making sure that individuals and children and adults with the most significant disabilities had access to the supports and services that are needed in order for them to take part in everyday life. And these are individuals who are most vulnerable to segregation, abuse, neglect, and institutionalization. And in the context of the webinar series, are very frequently completely overlooked in terms of really looking at their potential for employment and finding employment that really suits their specific needs, gifts, and talents. Membership in TASH is available for professionals, families, self-advocates, and organizations, and you can learn more about TASH at www.tash.org. At this point, I'd like to turn the session back over to John Butterworth, who will begin the presentation for today, and thank him, Alberto, and Sean for being the presenters this afternoon. So thank you, everyone.
And thank you, and welcome everybody. Glad to have you here. It's good to see robust representation by people who are actually involved in doing this work on a day-to-day basis. It's exciting, creative, interesting work that we're trying to accomplish. This first slide is just a holistic look at the things we need to work on, and we're focusing on the employment support circle today and how we're thinking about and planning for employment supports. Alberto and I will be taking kind of a broad research-based perspective to that. Sean will be following up by talking in a little more detail about delivering supports on a day-to-day basis. But we're at a point in time when we have about as good a chance as we'll ever have, and that's as someone who's been working on this for unemployment for almost 40 years now, and kind of lived through the early employment, supported employment systems change days when we really believed we were going to make employment the primary outcome for folks, and we've managed to circle back to that, but we're also doing it in a way that takes a much broader perspective. So in our work, and particularly in our Research and Training Center on Advancing Employment, we're working on each of those circles. If we're going to really make employment a priority and a first option for people, we need to engage individuals and families differently. We need to strengthen the kinds of employment supports that we provide. We need to reshape our organizations, and we missed this in the early supported employment days. We need to shape state policy and strategy, funding, investments, how case management works, and all of those pieces. And all of that falls within a community and a labor market and workplaces and the context of federal policy. Rich Luking and his colleagues back, almost 14 years ago now, in a book said, regardless of job seekers' skills, a level of motivation, skill, experience, attitude, support system, his or her ability to get a job will often depend on the effectiveness of employment specialists. Simply stated, if they're good, job seekers get jobs. If they're not, the barriers can become insurmountable. And that's really the challenge we're talking about today is how do we get to a point where the supports being delivered are excellent. There are some 35,000 people, there are a lot of us out there that are directly involved in employment support. We estimate something like 35,000 employment specialists and job coaches. There are over 8,000 voc rehab counselors. We have an extensive literature on effective support practices, but we also know, and we'll be presenting some of our data on that in a minute, we also know that we don't do a very good job of delivering employment supports in a way that lines up with what we know to be effective practice. We also don't really have a research literature that's very strong on what is effective practice. We don't have a lot of evidence-based practice in our field, with the exception of the mental health arena and some of the work that's come particularly out of Dartmouth and their model. But in the world of intellectual and developmental disabilities, there's not a strong research base for the work we're doing. We know a lot. We have a lot of writing on good practice, but we don't actually have much of a research literature to back that up. And finally, what employment specialists tell us is that they're often confused about their roles. They feel unprepared for their roles. They have limited access to formal training. I would add to that, state systems are just beginning to create more robust expectations around the credentials of people who do employment support. All of those are parts of that kind of larger holistic view of things that we need to be working on. A lot of what we know is embedded in the couple of credentialing opportunities that exist. So ACRE, many of you may have been part of ACRE-based training and certification. ACRE combines a process of certifying trainers and their curriculum in relationship to a set of identified competencies, and then requiring some implementation of those competencies in order to reach a point of getting the certificate at the end of the course. APSE, in its work, takes a little bit different approach, and the Certified Employment Support Professional credential is based on demonstration through an exam and through continuing coursework. The College of Employment Services is an online curriculum that some of you may have access to, that with content that was developed by our institute at ICI, and while it doesn't deliver a credential, it also hangs around that same framework of skills that ACRE and the CESP certificate focus on. And those fall into four major areas: application of core values and principles, assessment and career planning, community research and job development, workplace and related supports, and then APSE adds a fifth in the CESP credential on ongoing supports. So when we talk about an employment specialist, or we often use the term employment consultant, it covers kind of a broad swath of people. And I've got a slide coming up in a minute that'll help us a little understand kind of where your organizations are coming from. But we use the term employment consultant a lot, but people may also have more specialized roles like job developer, job coach, employment navigator. So if people could just take a second and click off in your organization, you can pick more than one here. What roles exist in your organization? It's just a little bit of a sense of how broad the kind of model that your organization is using. So quite a few people with an employment specialist role. A lot of people are also clicking off job coach, which indicates that there may be kind of multiple roles with multiple skill sets required, or differing kind of areas of focus required. Actually, nope, they're almost neck and neck. I was going to say job coach is coming out ahead, but they're actually almost neck and neck, job coach and employment specialist. 6 of you said that you use more of a generalist role for employment. And that's really, in my past work when I was directly involved in providing supports, we used generalist staff who did a little bit of who did everything. They did the initial career planning, they did the job placement, but were also simultaneously responsible for ongoing supports. That's largely the kind of structure that we use within our own employment services based at the Institute for Community Inclusion. If you've got other, feel free to throw some comments, other roles that people are involved in. That would be great. A couple of people using an evaluation specialist kind of a role. as we work on this, we've been doing this, particularly collaborating with some colleagues at the University of Minnesota, for about 10 years. And it started with a survey of employment consultants, employment specialists that goes back to 2009, trying to better understand who people are, then moving into that training and mentorship intervention. Kind of one of the key questions we've begun to pay attention to is how do we support people to implement the things that we train on. What we found in that simple intervention was that adding mentorship contacts following training led to people having not only finding more jobs for people, but also finding better jobs, more hours of work, and finding jobs faster for folks. So there's kind of a thread in that early study that influences some of what we'll be presenting here today in terms of thinking about what other supports do people need outside of training to be effective in their work. And then for the last 5 years or so, we've started collecting data directly from employment specialists and employment consultants to better understand what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, and moving into currently beginning to use that to provide feedback and support as part of a mentorship approach to help people improve their practice. And Alberto will be talking about that piece of our work in a couple of minutes. So we have, as we think about people who do employment support, we're thinking about three major goals. One is better understanding what employment specialists do. What does our work look like? How well does it hang together in terms of what we know about best practice? We've been doing a lot of that, and you'll see some of the outcomes of that. Second, what's the relationship of practice to outcome? And we're just beginning to get to a point where we have enough data to begin to explore that question. It's a complicated question because outcomes depend on a lot of variables, the level of support need of people that you're supporting, the skill sets people bring, the supervisory structures of organizations, the kind of training people have. But it's a critical piece of building that evidence base we need that really helps us move towards a quality improvement approach in our work. And then finally, how do we provide implementation support? And you'll see kind of our process of providing feedback to people about their work and how that compares to practice guidelines, helping people to be more reflective in their practice and think about their use of time, and what the business world calls micro-learning. So kind of how do we insert real-time, just-in-time, brief learning opportunities that fit the kind of realities and schedules that we all live in, and make learning more of a continuous process rather than something you go away for 3 days for and then come back cold to your core job. So we started the current phase of our work simply a few years ago by asking experts in the field, trainers, as well as people with highly effective organizations to nominate employment specialists that they felt were particularly effective at supporting people in finding jobs, in finding creative jobs, and in supporting people with significant support needs in finding jobs. And this model frames kind of the major themes or components of good employment support that came out of that work. Most of it is probably not surprising. It matches our understanding of best practice for the most part, and the frameworks that APSE and their CESP framework and ACRE use. It matches pretty well our understanding of good customized employment. But it added a couple of things that we felt were useful. One is a couple of elements that we don't normally think about. So on the far left, and the blue text here is kind of the key element, and the green is the outcome of that area of focus. So On the far left, we don't really think a lot about building trust as a key part of the work that we do, but it came out strongly in our conversations, and once we had our group of nominated employment specialists, we spent time talking to them, but we also talked to people who received support from them, family members of people who received support from them, and their supervisors as part of understanding their process and providing support. So building trust provides kind of a different focus area, and interestingly, it's also consistent with some parallel research from Virginia Commonwealth University that was just published that's focused specifically on better understanding customized employment, and the first 3 of 12 elements that they identified include building rapport and mindfully listening, things that sound an awful lot like what people talked about with us that we defined as building trust. The second element that we don't talk about frequently is supports planning. That's at the bottom with a goal and an outcome of smooth job entry. And it's in talking with folks, it's thinking early rather than at the point the person gets a job about the supports they'll need to be successful in a job. So do they need some communication supports? Do they need some sort of assistive technology, either electronic or more practical? What kind of transportation needs do they have, and how do we build that into our thinking and our supports planning? Have we addressed things like benefits planning? But that those things are addressed early and often, and not just at the point that a person finds a job and it becomes a crisis. More typically, getting to know a job seeker covers discovery and career planning and our need to identify the criteria that defines a successful outcome of a job search for a person. Finding tasks and finding jobs is, and people really emphasize the importance of understanding an employer and looking for tasks, not just looking for job postings or positions. That's very consistent with our conversations about customized employment and what an effective job search is, going beyond posted positions, but really understanding an employer's needs and shaping work opportunities based on a match between their needs and an individual. I think the other parts that kind of jump out is the circular and interconnected nature of those first 4 elements. So this is not a strictly sequential process. It's an iterative process and an interconnected process, and you really do many of those first 4 things on the left around the circle simultaneously, or at least you move back and forth between them. Thinking about building trust, these are quotes from some of the people that were part of that study. One of the participants said, "I've got to establish ground rules from the beginning, and the first is, I'm not here to find you a job. You and I together as a team are going to find a job." So part of trust is building a sense of teamness and shared responsibility and the kind of communication it takes to approach things that way. Getting to know the job seeker, listen to the person first, make sure their voice is heard, because it's too easy for it to be lost among agencies, the state, families, the employer if they're employed. Understanding the importance and power of an individual's voice in the discovery or career planning process. And finally, thinking about support after hire, and I think this kind of cycles back to the early focus on understanding criteria well and understanding the match well, and that's the customized employment element. We've done a better job at matching people in their jobs. Now the job coach's role is really shifted to connecting the person with the employer, making connections so they can back out quickly. Thinking about fading as a term that we talk about a lot as a key skill. Fading isn't really something that happens after the job. It's something that happens early as we understand the person, understand the employer, and create a workable match. And if those things are successful, we can move ourselves out quickly. I'm going to pass on to Alberto to talk some about our direct engagement with employment specialists and some of what we're learning about how they use their time and the kinds of supports that are helpful to them in moving towards more effective practice. Alberto?
Yep, thank you, John, and thank you everyone for your interest in this presentation. Switching gear a little bit, John talked about what we know and where we should go. I'm going to talk about a study that with John and our colleagues at the University of Minnesota have been doing for the past couple of years and trying to understand what effective employment practices are actually implemented. So we developed an app for smartphones, and we recruited about 61 employment specialists from 37 employment programs in 17 states. They completed some baseline survey, quarterly surveys. It was a longitudinal 1-year-long study from started in June 2016, ending in May 2017. And they completed daily surveys on their phones every day at a different time. And also they were involved in a monthly community of practice, and we provided them some performance feedback, individual feedback. So on this slide, you see the screenshot of the daily survey. It was sent on their phone, and essentially there were 3 main questions asking what was the primary support activity that they were doing during the 30 minutes before they got the text on their phone, who was the interaction with during that activity, and where they were during that activity. And the combination of the responses to these 3 questions helped us to get a snapshot of what the employment consultants as a group, what activities they were implementing, how much time they invested in each activities. And because the text was sent every day at a different random time, we kind of covered the whole day work of the employment consultants. So here is an example of what kind of data we got. And what it shows, the pie chart shows a blue wedge that says supports leading to hire, 30%. That means that the employment consultants as a group over the year that we collected the data spent about 30% of their time providing supports that lead to hire. Those include getting to know job seekers, finding jobs, and any other supports that before hire that lead to hire. So this is an important first opportunity to reflect: is that 30% enough or not? There are not really benchmarks for how much time employment consultants should spend in supporting some people in finding jobs. But the idea, probably like if they spend, that time corresponds to about 2.5 hours per day. And we know that repeating tasks is what makes us effective. So there's some reason to think that probably investing more time in supports leading to hire would help to make the employment consultants more effective, thinking about their job is very complex, like John mentioned before with the quote from Looking. Employment consultants handle relationships with job seekers who may have no or limited work experience. They have to relate with family members, with other professionals in residential units, case managers. At the same time, they have to handle relationships with employers who don't know anything about our world of human services. Employers just are interested in making sure that if they hire someone, the job will be done. So it's a complex job, and probably having more time spent in those activities would be helpful. The pie chart shows that the rest of the time was spent 26% in providing support after hire, job coaching, which is an important component of providing support to people with disabilities. And it will be interesting to see if by doing better, the support leads into hire. It's possible to maybe find better job benches that require less intense support after hire, or finding jobs in places where natural support from coworkers is available, and therefore professional support, job coaching can be reduced. So it will be interesting to examine that more closely. Clearly, 39% spent in administrative activities may be an issue. And by the way, I saw John just posted a question in the chat pod. What would it take to increase the amount of time spent on supports leading to hire? So if any of you has any suggestions about what that could be, please feel free to share with us. So administrative activities could be reduced maybe by reducing the amount of paperwork, or using technology like mobile devices for completing forms while maybe on the road, as opposed to having to come back to the office. And then 15% of the time was spent in non-employment related activities. That includes community non-based, non-work support, or facility-based work, or day programs. I think there should be also a poll. Let's see if it shows up, and it would ask, what do you think, how much time the employment consultants should spend in supports that lead to hire? Is 30% enough? Probably yes, probably no, or not sure. Just curious to see what the audience think about it. And it looks like the majority says probably no, probably it's not enough. Okay, yep, that's the majority says probably not enough. Okay, so we know that time spent in support leading to hire is important, but it's not everything. It's also the quality of that support. So the next data I'm showing is a pie chart showing where the employment consultants invest their time when they provide support leading to hire, when they provide that 30% of time. And the pie chart shows that 41% of the time was spent in office, 24% in community settings, and 18% in businesses. Here, the key takeaway is that we like to see time spent in businesses and in community settings. Those are indications that the employment consultants are using good practices like situational assessment, therefore observing job seekers in real workplaces or community settings, how they react to the environment. That we know from the literature is a better way to understand the support needs, the preferences of the job seekers. It's also spending time in businesses. It's also an indication that the employment consultants are doing probably informational interviews or business tours, which are important because they help the employment consultants to understand what tasks are available in those in those workplaces, and perhaps how to reorganize those tasks in a way to negotiate and create a new job, and especially for the population of adults with intellectual disabilities, creating a new job description often is a good way to find a job that otherwise may not necessarily be readily available. It's also an opportunity for the job seekers to experiment with real workplaces, and therefore themselves develop better ideas about what type of job they really would like, what kind of work culture they really like. So that's for the where, and the next slide shows the responses to who was the interaction with. And again, while providing supports leading to hire. And here we see a bar chart, and the good news is that over like 64% of the time was spent with person that they supported, and that's clearly important to spend time to do the finding jobs and getting to know job seekers and provide other supports when they are these tasks are done with the job seeker. It means the job seeker is more involved, and that's positive. The relationship, the interactions with business personnel and family and friends are also important. Again, with the business personnel, it's a good indication, and they reported spending about 29% of the time with business personnel. That include employers. Again, we don't know is that enough or not, but we know that spending time with the employers is important. It means the employment consultants are expanding their network of employers, are networking, have greater opportunities to learn the language of the employers, be better at understanding quickly what are the needs of the employers and how to address those needs. Similarly, interacting with family and friends is very important with for the IDD population, considering that families have known the job seekers for a very long time, and they can provide a perspective that otherwise may not necessarily be available to the employment consultants, given the relatively limited time employment consultants can spend with the job seekers. Families can also help by giving job leads or connecting with new employers, and therefore the employment consultants, every time meet or work with a new family, will have a chance to expand the network of employers and build that network of connections with employers. Families can also provide support for the logistics, emotional support, perhaps transportation. When they refer an employer, it's more likely that that workplace could provide more of the natural support that we know is effective and makes a job more inclusive and increase the job satisfaction of the job seekers. So here is a quick poll about how did you find your current job, and this will help to introduce the next slide. And the responses are, I answered a want ad through a friend, through a family member, through an employer temp agency, walked in and applied, or other. And we see a lot of people respond through a friend, and 14, 16 responded through a friend, 10 answered a want ad, 2 through a family members. Here the point, thank you very much. The point is that we know from the literature that especially for the population with intellectual disabilities. Finding a job seems easier through connections because browsing ads, it puts the person in competition with a massive number of other applicants. And often companies have screening tools, and they screen out people who may not fit with company requirements, and people with disabilities often tend to be screened out. So connecting with employers directly through the families or friends is the winning strategy. The data I'm showing is a pie chart showing that the employment consultants, when they were finding jobs, 38% of the time they were browsing ads, and 13% of the time was spent researching a company to understand, and that's good, to understand the sector, what kind of opportunities there might be in that company. 12% was spent in cold calling, a practice that is not recommended in the literature, and 26% was spent in networking. So again, we see from the data that probably there's room for improving the strategies that employment consultants are using, perhaps by reducing their investment in browsing ads and increasing the time in networking. Job negotiation is shown as only 2%, and so that's definitely an area that would be interesting and good to increase. Moving quickly to the end, switching gear a little bit, we use the closing screen of the daily survey to provide that kind of support that John was talking about before. So we collect the data from the employment consultants, and in the closing screen of the survey, we provided some feedback. In the left screenshot shows, hey, you as a group spent 2 hours and 49 minutes every day on average in administrative activities. Can you share your ideas for streamlining administrative tasks? And we would like to share those with the group. On the right side, the screenshot shows we're reminding them that the goal that month was to streamline the administrative tasks, and we actually added a question in the daily survey asking them if they were successful in achieving that goal, and the day after we would show the data, and so we show them that 19% yes, were successful in reducing the administrative tasks, and 53% said they will be trying. And the concept is to let them know they are part of a group. Other people, other peers have the same problems, and they want to reduce or streamline the administrative tasks. And hopefully they will try to bring up the issue with their supervisors or the colleagues and brainstorm ideas. Here is another example of microlearning. So sending chunks of information that can be used maybe in between meetings or when they have a minute or two, which is not often, but it may happen. So on the left screenshot, we gave a tip about job negotiation, and then we added a link of a 3-minute video about job negotiation. And on the screenshot on the right side, we showed we gave reminding them of a goal for that month in the community of practice to increase job negotiation, and we provided a link to a very short article about how to do job negotiation. Again, the idea, the concept is to this to be a reminder. Hopefully they have attending a full training sometime in earlier, and this works as a reminder about the key concepts, about best practices, or it can be just nudging them to think about it and talk with the colleagues. the whole idea is that traditional training is important, but it work better if it is paired with ongoing other support activities. I think that was the last, and well, just a quick on what the feedback we got from the participants. They enjoyed, they liked the opportunity to reflect on their activities, and they thought the tool was simple, and that was our goal essentially. So with that, I'm passing it back to John for the key takeaway points.
So just a quick summary, and then I'll pass to Sean. I think part of this is the importance of reflecting on implementation time, how we use the resource we have, which is our time, and connecting that to what we know about best practice and improving our understanding of best practice. But reflection, I think, is a key takeaway for us. We also need to get better at leveraging technology, reducing administrative time. A lot of what people told us is using the data as part of a process of understanding their work, or said more formally, database decision-making, was a really critical resource to them. It helped them to think critically about the decisions they made on a day-to-day basis. And finally, Alberto was talking about the importance of continuous learning. So micro-learning, mobile learning, personalized learning. We need to think differently about how we structure the supports that we provide to folks who do this work. And we can come back if you have questions about that. We'll have some time at the end, but let me pass it over to Sean so he can take us to the second segment.
Hello, Sean here. I am going to follow up on the information that Alberto and John shared with us by talking about some of the specific skill sets that are really helpful in implementing this work. So it's great to see that there's so many people doing the work on the call, and so we'll speak specifically to those skill sets. There's also a number of managers, and so I want you to think about what are the considerations and activities that you can do, and we'll talk about that to really implement these skill sets. Same thing for policymakers that are funding the type of work that we do. Because I think the data that we've seen so far shows that there's a big difference that can be made when we spend the time doing what we know makes a difference and helping people find and keep their jobs, and that there's not enough of that time out there. So whatever we can do to maximize that time is really important. My name is Sean. Just as a little bit of introduction, I do a couple of things. I work for WISE here in Seattle. We're the Washington Initiative for Support Employment. One, I support people in crisis who are at risk of losing access to the community. And most of the time this means that I work on communication. Two, I collaborate with employment agencies who are looking to provide innovative employment services. Three, I work with schools and districts to ensure that the curriculum they're teaching is matching with what students are graduating into in adult services. And then four, I work to support system change when agencies, states, provinces, or other government actors want to move from segregated congregate services to the community. I have 3 rules that I apply to my service, and these are my rules, these are not your rules, but if I ever have the opportunity to collaborate or work with you, this is how I approach my job. Number 1, it's not okay, it is okay to say that I don't know how to teach something. It's not my job to say that someone can or cannot learn. I can't tell you how many families I've worked with who said to me, well, a health professional back when my kid was 5 or 6 years old said that he or she would never, or that a teacher from either kindergarten all the way up into a transition program made claims that they could kind of see the future about what this person's life would look like. I think it's really important in agencies that we practice humility and practice saying that I don't know how to do something, because too often our own deficits become the story that we talk about in terms of someone's disability. We're going to dive into that a little bit more in a second. But 2, nobody has to earn the right to be in the community. And 3, teaching someone skills about living in the community can only happen in one place, and that's the community. So a little story for you here. I was working with an organization up in Ontario that has started expanding supported employment services to people with autism for the first time. And this was about 3 years ago when this project started. And right on my first visit, the province announced that they're closing the front door to the sheltered workshops in the province. So the agency that I was focusing on specifically kind of retooled our time together and decided to not only focus on supported employment for people with autism, but instead to kind of expand to find a place in the community for every person that was currently being served in their sheltered workshop. And they successfully did this in the course of about 12 months. But one of the individuals that they're supporting was receiving 2 years of one-to-one support making sandwiches. So there was this community program where they made sandwiches for people in need, and this individual was responsible for making the sandwiches, yet required a staff person to be there with him the entire time, doing probably about half of the work. So I calculated this kind of a rough cocktail napkin calculation here, but that equals to be about 236 hours of support. Now, depending on how much how much these services cost, I find most of the time agencies, depending on the state, depending on the funder, you're billing at about $70, $75. The lowest that I've seen is about $30 an hour. So if we're looking at $75 an hour, 236 hours support, 2 years of one-to-one support making sandwiches equals to a $17,000, $760 bill. So how do you solve a $17,760 problem? The employment consultant that was working with this individual had supported them in a residential setting years past, and remembered that there was a particular affinity for numbers. So she spent a couple hours kind of watching the situation as it exists. She spent a couple hours just in conversation and talking to people. She came up with a couple ideas. Then she spent a couple hours just implementing them, trying them one-on-one, one by one, and seeing what would work. And ultimately what she came up with was a accounting system. She knew this guy really liked math, and she set up a accounting system in these 6 hours, which cost about $450. And dude does not need to have somebody with him making those sandwiches all that time. And so if we think back to my first rule, that it's okay to say, I don't know how to teach something, this guy's story for 2 years was that because of his disability, he needed to have a one-on-one coach. And what this agency realized really quickly was this is not about his skills or skill deficits. It really was about the support that was being given. So that's why I think, in answer to John's question earlier on in the morning here, and afternoon, sorry, I'm on the West Coast, so it's still morning for me. What would it take to spend more time helping people get jobs? I think it's really dialing into the supports that people have in place. So that's why we're going to talk about systematic instruction and long-term supports. As part of that, we're going to think about task analysis thinking, task design, teaching strategies, and tools that are available for long-term supports. So task analysis at its core is the process of breaking down a task into smaller, more manageable components. This might be something that has been used a lot in your practice. This might be a concept that's new to you by definition, but I think it's a process that we engage with all the time, all over the place. A couple of years ago, I was watching The Daily Show, and this author of this book, The Checklist Manifesto, was being interviewed. And the man who wrote this book is a neurosurgeon, or actually was a neurosurgeon, has made so much money off this book that I think he's just touring and talking about this now. And what I learned is that there's an epidemic in our country of people going into surgery, and so they're kind of opened up, and when the surgery is done, they get closed up by the doctors, and the epidemic is that things are being left inside of the body. So scissors, scapula, all sorts of stuff, right? And the problem is when a whole bunch of different problems with that, but when something is left in the body ends up pushing it out. So here is my picture to illustrate that. That's what I think of when that comes up for me. But essentially, at the core, what this guy is saying is that we need to do task analysis and write down a list of everything that's in the room before we do the surgery and check it off before we close the person back up. So the task analysis is being used all over the place, and I want to practice with you right now a version of the task analysis that I find really helpful. So if you can, if you have a piece of paper close to you, pull it out, and I want you to make it look like my piece of paper. So you'll see there's two columns. There's a line down the middle. On the left-hand side is the word Q at the top, and the right-hand side is the word step. And if you look also, starting on the bottom left-hand side, I'm numbering 1 to 15 or 20. The key part is you're starting number 1 at the bottom left-hand side. I'm going to give you just a couple minutes to get that written. So it will all make sense. Actually, so the reason, I'm going to explain the reason why we're starting our numbers at the bottom in a second, but it's a magic trick. That's your little cue about what, or clue about what I'm doing here. But I'm going to teach you all a magic trick with this task analysis. Okay, so you have steps on the right, you have cues on the left, you have numbers coming up from the bottom. When I think about steps, this is the definition that I'm working off of. A step is an action that one does to complete a task or a link of a skill chain. I have a video here, and I would encourage you, when you're training somebody on how to do their job, first, learn the task yourself, and second, learn that task from somebody who's an expert in doing it. And third, build your materials that you're going to use to support the person using the experts in the room. I'm an employment specialist. A lot of us are employment specialist job coaches. Most likely, we're not going to be experts at the skills that we're training people on. The skills already exist, or the experts already exist out in the community. So this is a video of somebody across the street from my office making a cup of coffee. The type of coffee is Americano, which is just water with 2 shots of coffee on top of it. She works really fast. She's a great barista, so I asked her to make 2 cups of coffee. I would like you to write the steps starting from the bottom on the right-hand side, so that's the, starting at number 1 in the step column, all the steps that you see in making 1 cup of coffee. Now I asked her to make 2 because she works fast, just so you can see those steps. This is about a 2-minute video, and we're going to watch it together. And I'm going to talk through some of the vocabulary for you as we go here. Got to make sure that you use the Seattle coffee vocabulary in task analysis.
This part might seem a little like cheating because they've got the auto-dosing grinder.
So that's called a portafilter. That's the coffee grinder. This is a tamper. And if the video is not playing for you, you might have to push play, or it could be your internet connection. It's only a 2-minute video, so if you miss it, I'll send out a link so you can look at it. Look at how fast she goes. One coffee is done.
Number 2.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I will make sure that that we send out a link to this video, so if it did not work on your side, you'll be able to see it. And again, I encourage you, when you're helping to set up supports and getting things figured out for people, rely on the experts that are out there. I worked as a barista maybe like 15 years ago. It's been a long time. If I were to train someone today on how to make a coffee, this woman is the expert in the room, and it's not me. So I want you to compare your list to the list that I had here. Hopefully it looks something similar. See, the thing is that every task analysis is going to be different, right? It depends on the needs of our learner. It depends on the task itself. It depends on a whole bunch of different variables. I also want to mention that not every single person needs to have this level of task analysis. You're going to use a task analysis when you're preparing to teach, when you know that the learner has a history of needing a little bit of extra support. Also, you're going to use a task analysis when you are very comfortable with the task and it's novel for somebody else, something that you're so used to doing in your daily life, because it's really easy to forget steps when you are an expert at something. So this is a pretty basic task analysis, a pretty list, good list of the different steps. But how often are you in a situation where somebody knows the next step? You know they know how to do the job, yet you're still needing to be there to prompt them through. How often do you hear that phrase where you're supporting someone and either you or a colleague has to say, what's next? What's next? And they know what's next, but they need you to be there to say what's next to move on to whatever is next. If that is you, then that is an indication that you have become the cue. You've become the prompt that elicits the response from the person. And so you're going to structure things a little bit different. This is how I define a cue, a signal to a performer to begin an action, a hint or indication about how to behave in a particular interaction, or a reminder to do something. So this is what the task analysis looks like when we think about the cue. The cue tells us that it's time to do the next step. So you see a customer orders the coffee, it's time to fill the cup with hot water, put next to the coffee machine. I know that I'm done with that step when a cup is filled, it's next to the coffee machine. If you find yourself in the situation where you're constantly having to cue somebody to move on to the next step, even though you know they know that next step, I need you to build your supports the prompt to the environmental cue, because that will tell you, that will teach the person how to be more interdependent into the environment that they're in, as opposed to dependent on the support staff. So again, thinking about ways that we can build our support so professionals and employment specialists have more time to spend in the areas that we know will really make an impact in helping people with disabilities get jobs. So here's the magic trick, in case you're curious. The reason why we start from the bottom is it creates a self-graphing list. So if you see on this list here, what the support person has done is that they have counted so each one of these lines is a day, and so they've counted all the steps that the person did right and drew a circle around it. So on the first day, the person did 4 out of 13 steps correctly, so that person circled 4. Next day it was 6, next day it was 5, and then eventually got to 13. And what that allows you to do is have a real quick visual graph to show progress, which is quite helpful. Okay, let's move on to task design considerations. So when do we start considering task design? I'd argue that we consider it from the very, very beginning, because we want to start thinking about how to fade our support from the very moment that we start working with somebody. One of my mentors, Terry Johnson, talks about the purpose of task design is to determine the most appropriate way for a learner to complete the task. So here's some questions you might want to ask yourself. What is the current design? Has the work been standardized? Are there changes that I can make to accommodate physical ease and efficiency? Is the task designed to support learning and independence? And is there an opportunity to determine performance standards? So what are the expectations for accuracy, productivity, and conduct? It's important that we avoid setting a higher standard for the people that we're supporting. I encourage you to do an environmental analysis where you sit in the environment without throwing, coworkers under the rug here. We want to just get a good understanding of what is the current level of performance in the room so we can teach to that level of performance. It seems, at least in my experience, that when people with disabilities have that lens on them or that microscope, that sometimes we hold higher expectations for some people that we support. And it's easy for managers that we work with and other coworkers to have these same expectations. And so the skilled employment consultant is going to be able to address this in subtle ways with the manager. So, you're not, at least in my experience as this turned out, is that, I've supported someone at a coffee shop that sometimes takes a little bit longer to do certain things, but that person is also never sneaking into the back room and going on to Snapchat and using social media, whereas the rest of his coworkers were. And so, I had to have kind of a subtle conversation with the manager about, true performance and true productivity looking across the whole shift. And the person that I was supporting, at least in my data, was way more productive than the people that he was working around, even though sometimes the manager did not see it that way. So what about sensory issues? Sensory issues are kind of challenging to talk about because it's hard to really know if someone is indeed experiencing a sensory difference, because that's something that happens inside of their body. But I think it's really key to task design, because when we get to know somebody and get to know the way they experience the world, we're going to set environments up differently. It wasn't until 2014 that we had real evidence, and this study comes from the Journal of Neuroscience, that people with disabilities, and in this case specifically autism, do have sensory differences that can be triggered by stressful situations. And I think getting a new job, going to new places, new environments, that is like a key stressful situation. So research is rarely poetic, but I thought this was rather poetic, saying that children with autism live in a world that resembles a badly dubbed foreign movie. They struggle to integrate what they see and what they hear. What the researchers did is they used brain scanning technology by putting these kids in a machine and exposing them to different sensory inputs. And so going into a brain scanning machine is, I imagine, I've never been inside one, a rather stressful situation. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but when I was in the Peace Corps and I was living in Bulgaria, Will and Grace came to Bulgaria, and it was dubbed. And so it was an amazing experience to see the whole country engage in this dialogue simply with some issues that Will and Grace was bringing up. But it was also interesting to watch how Bulgarian is a shorter language than English. It's tighter. And so the dialogue would have moved on from the joke, yet the joke was still happening on screen. So I definitely can relate to that. If you're interested in learning more about sensory issues, I highly recommend Temple's second to the last book that she wrote. It's called The Autistic Brain, and specifically Chapter 4, Hiding and Seeking, has some really great tips on how we can address sensory issues. Okay. Let's think about teaching to independence. And I was actually recently in a workshop with somebody in North Dakota, and they brought up this idea that, like, who really is independent? I'm surrounded by coworkers as I speak, and I am totally interdependent on the people that I work with. So when I say teaching independence, what I'm really saying is teaching to independence from us supervisors, from us service providers. And we're thinking about interdependence with coworkers and with the environment that we're helping somebody access. So when we think about building supports, I think we need to think about what type of support or why support is needed at work. So I break this down into 4 different areas. Either the person needs help learning the job, the person needs help communicating on the job, the person needs help understanding the social rules on the job, or 4, the person needs help in adjusting and accommodating the environment or task to meet individualized needs. Now, sometimes these needs express the same across multiple areas of why support is needed. That's why I think it's important to really get to know your learner so we know kind of where the source of this support need is coming from. And then it's also helpful to think, what are some reasons that someone could lose their job? Either the person can't do the job, the person no longer wants to do the job, or the person's accommodations do not fit the job as tasks or environments change. Now, in building out supports, I want to make a case for visualizing communication. I remember the first job that I helped somebody get was at a Boeing subcontractor. And they were building, it was 2 or 3 years before the Dreamliner, the Boeing Dreamliner was released, and they were building the locks and the seatbelts for the Boeing Dreamliner. And I, in my early 20s, was going to go in and task analyze all these different tasks on building this Dreamliner, and I was going to teach Boeing how to build an airplane. Of course, I walked in, and there's multiple languages spoken on the floor. We had Russian, Ukrainian, Spanish, and English. They had already done a task analysis and broken down all the steps on how to build these seat belts and these locks and these floor panels, and every step was represented by a picture. Oftentimes, the business community is ahead of us in some of these areas, and this is one where I know for sure they are. So anytime you're going through a drive-through, if you go through Starbucks or if you go to McDonald's, peek in, and you're going to see that all those recipes are broken down with pictures. So this is a universal accommodation that helps everybody. Here's another way to think about it. It takes 0.15 seconds from the moment light hits the retina to when earliest recognition of basic object identity can occur. It can take unexpected textual information 9 seconds to process to the brain. That means that we can process visuals up to 60,000 times faster than text. 12 seconds, that is the American attention span in the year 2000. 8 seconds, unfortunately, was the American attention span in the year 2016. That might explain the state of some of our national dialogue at this point. And then 9 seconds. Who wants to guess what 9 seconds represents? Anybody in the Q&A chat window there? 9 seconds. If 12 seconds was the American attention span in the year 2000, 8 seconds is the American attention span in 2018. Well, I'll just give it to you. It's the attention span of a goldfish. Do you see the problem here, though? If Americans have, now this is everybody, not just people with disabilities, it's everybody. If the American attention span is 8 seconds, but it can take us 12 seconds to process unexpected textual information, visual supports are an accommodation for everybody. Another way to think about it, textual description, a curved line with every point equal distance from the center, a graphic description. So why visual supports? Learners complete tasks by themselves, therefore increasing independence. We see that learners learn more rapidly. We see demonstrated decreased levels of frustration, anxiety, and aggression, and we adjust readily to changes in our environment. Outside of the world of disability, environmental supports are everywhere. This is a fish and chips place that's here in Seattle, and these are soundboards that are above all the tables. So they look like birdhouses, but in fact, there's carpet there that holds the sound so the conversation you're having is not echoing all over the entire room. This is a trash can and a recycling or compost that I found in Vancouver, Canada. So with real clear visual description of what should be going in there. This is an environmental support, visual support that I saw in England. Vote with your butts, who's the best player in the world. Here is a support that I found in North Dakota. This is a tip jar where the person serving drinks was maximizing their tips by engaging people in a fun question about the North Dakota State Fair, which is happening in Minot that week. If you ever have a chance to check out the North Dakota State Fair in Minot, I highly recommend it. It's a blast. So when we're thinking about building out supports, here's some tools that I'd like you to consider. One, social narratives. So these are social stories, social comics, power cards. I included these words here in the slide because you could do a Google search and find a whole bunch of different examples of these. But basically, social narratives tell somebody how, and to a lesser degree what, but more importantly, how they're supposed to be in a new, novel social situation. I use social stories a lot to help explain to somebody what's going to be happening in a job interview. It's helpful not just for the individual who's never had a job interview, but it's also helpful for the person interviewing or the other coworkers in the environment to kind of explain, you know, this is who the person is that's coming in, this is what they're expecting. So kind of expectations are set for everybody in a level platform of understanding. 2, schedules, individualized, are really important. And something I've been thinking a lot about recently is with schools, how often I see individuals coming out of transition programs that aren't able to wayfind, aren't able to use a schedule, and how often that's described, again, as a feature of their disability. And while that may be true, I think one feature of high school that a lot of people with disabilities don't get access to is, you know, for the first time in your life, you have to navigate going to, you know, 8 or 9 different places in the school building throughout your day. You've got to manage your schedule, you've got to know, you know. So students in general in a typical population have 4 years of practice, and generally the students that I get access to coming out of the transition program don't have a lot of experience with schedules. So sometimes we have to teach that. And I encourage you, again, to not think about it as a story of their disability, but maybe a story of the access and the type of services that someone's had before. Visual supports. So again, like I said, we're playing catch up. The business community gets this way more than what I see in the disability community. Self-monitoring. So from a research or from disability service standpoint, we call it self-monitoring. The rest of the world has moved on and called this gamification. So I hear a lot in person-centered planning meetings or when I meet with a family, all my kid wants to do is play video games. The best thing that they're at is, you know, they're really good at video games. I don't know how this will work. When I hear that somebody's really into video games, great. Not only do I know they have great hand-eye coordination, that there's some, you know, physical dexterity there. What I know is that generally that person is going to be really a great candidate for a gamification type system. I was introduced by a teacher I was in Anchorage, but this teacher came from the Arctic Circle, so up in North Alaska, an app that they're using called Habitica, which basically turns an individual's entire day into a role-playing game where you get to set different levels of points based on what people are doing throughout their day. So Habitica, I definitely recommend checking that out. We're thinking about ways that we can encourage more of this like fun into planning out our day. And then finally, universal apps. So we, in Washington State, we just ran a conference recently, and I got to see some of the data from the app on that conference. And what I learned was that 40% of the people in our system that came to our conference, and it's a community summit, so it's a lot of different people from, you know, education, employment, residential, families, people with disabilities, so it's kind of broad spectrum of the adult service community around disability here in Washington State. 40% of our people had Apple phones, 35% of people had Android phones, and the rest had something else. So if you are in the position where you're supporting somebody on how to be independent, that's more and more going to look like how do you use a device. I think it's really important for us to have a perspective that we know how Apple devices work and how Android devices work. And I encourage you, when you're thinking about support programs specifically, to focus on general applications, not disability-specific applications. So if you think about like a scheduling app, for example, for the longest time, I was using FirstThen HD, which is a fabulous app that's available only on iOS devices. And it's a way for you to structure and create a picture schedule. It looks like a blackboard, so it's clearly designed, it looks like it's designed for kids, but it's also designed so somebody other than the person using it programs it, which does not lead to independence. Well, here comes Google, and they release an app called Google Keep, which is a note-taking app, but you can also put pictures onto there. And not only can you put pictures, you can tie that app to geolocation or to time, which means I've seen job coaches set up a picture schedule that will pop up on an individual's device when they walk into their place of employment, because the phone is looking at where you are on the map, and it knows, okay, when I walk into this place, I need to have this support brought up. So maximum independence. It's really cool, and that app is free. So I encourage you to look outside of disability-specific apps and look at apps that are designed for a more universal audience. With that said, I would like to save these last 10 minutes for questions. So I'm going to answer one that I see right here from Michelle, and then I'm going to open it up to everybody else and maybe hand this back to our chairperson to manage the questions. But what was the name of the app, the role-playing for a schedule? So that was Habitica, and it wasn't a schedule app. I'll type it here, Habitica. But it was a way to manage, it's like it gives you points throughout the day for different things that you do. There's some awesome videos that kind of show its power if you do like a YouTube search for Habitica. And with that, let's open it up if anybody has any other questions for John, Alberto, or myself.
John,
so I see another question from...
Yep, no, go ahead. I was
just
going to repeat the question.
From Lynn. Yeah, so there was a question from Lynn. Can you say more about the game the person created on the job? So yeah, I'll give you two examples. One, this was a transition program, and so they were working on specific some things that socially that the person needed to work on, and also tasks. And so they worked. So the teacher worked with the student to tag some of those goals that they're working on with specific points. And so the student and the teacher would both score individually, give themselves a score, and then would be reinforced for having those scores being close to matching. So you're working on the student having that self-reflection about what's actually happening in that moment. And the second example came out of Ontario. Somebody was moving from a sheltered workshop and had a couple of months where they weren't doing much, gained a lot of weight, it became a medical issue. And so they worked with him this guy really loved board games, so they created a board game, tied it to a pedometer that the person was wearing, so a step counter, and would work through this board game based on how many steps the person took, and the person got to decide what they wanted to do when they won the board game. So that was another way that they used gamification, or in a research terminology, self-monitoring, to look at those different skills. Could you describe a situation where it might be difficult to determine the distance between a task and a cue, or is that not a concern? Let's go back to, I'm going to bring back the slide that showed the difference between tasks and cues. Okay. So a step and a cue. So a step is something that you're doing to complete a skill chain, and a cue is an indication that it's time to do the step. So you see on my list of cues, there's no really action that the person's taking. It's all passive. The action is all on the right-hand side, the steps. So the cue, and you don't need to go into this granular level of detail for most people. This is a situation where somebody is addicted to their support system, or addicted to their support person, I should say. Another way to describe that is the support person has built themselves into the job. The support person is the cue that's telling the person it's time to do the step. So hopefully that shows the difference between the two there. Does that answer your question, Brian? Cool. Any other questions for me or for John or for Alberto? Alberto, John, anything you guys want to add to kind of wrap all this up, or any thoughts that you had?
Nothing specific to add. I think, kind of the key theme here is how do we be really intentional about the work we do, whether it's the kind of supports that Sean was talking about, or more broadly as a team and a community, how do we monitor the work we do and reflect on our practice and keep key principles and key elements, the pieces that were in that graphic model, in mind as we think about, are we using our time the way that we want to be using our time? Are we using it in the way that's most effective for the folks that we're supporting? And how do we wrap supports for those kinds of questions and reflections around the folks who are most involved in delivering it? So I think those are the key themes. You can follow up more on some of our work at www.thinkwork.org. That's a good portal into some of the work we're doing. Not on here is Sean's web address which would be www.gowise, GOWISE.org. Or any of us, I'm sure, would be happy to get follow-up questions as people have had a chance to reflect on this. So please get back to us if you'd like to.
Thank you
I also included
so much.
our YouTube channel there, just in case anybody wants to see it. There's a lot of different examples of the work and people's stories on WISE movies.
That is fantastic. Sean and John and Alberto, you have given us so many resources today. This was a truly wonderful webinar, and I certainly learned a lot as well. On your screen right now, you see points of contact for both TASH and ANCOR. If you have any additional questions, if you would like to see us try to address any other specific employment-related questions in the remainder of our webinars in this series, if you'd like us to forward any questions to our presenters today, John or Alberto or Sean, we're happy to do that as well. In just a little bit, you'll be getting a link to an evaluation for today. We ask you to please take a minute, fill that out, and you'll also be receiving a recording and also a copy of today's slides so that if any of your colleagues missed today's presentation, if they were registered, they will be receiving that as well. Thank you so very much, everyone. What a wonderful way to spend an afternoon. We appreciate the knowledge and the information that you have shared with us today. Friends, have a wonderful afternoon.
Take care.